But
People always ask why I don't keep up with pop culture, and I'm like, I have enough drama in my extended family to ever.
Well, yeah, your family is pop culture.
That's fair.
Is that crazy to think about that you're pop culture to people?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also weird that everybody like knows what's happening. Like when your family's falling apart because your parents are divorced.
Yeah.
Did the whole world know about it?
No.
Yeah. I love when people are like, I didn't like you when the show first started. And I'm like, when I was 15.
Hey friends, it's Kody from Without a Crystal Ball. Welcome back to my channel. It is Wednesday, January 8th, 2025. Well, with the brand new year comes New Year's resolutions. Now, some of you might be into New Year's resolutions. Others of you may not. But someone from the Sister Wives made the decision last year in the fall in 2024. I know it's always weird to say last year when it was only like a week ago, but whatever. Late fallish Madison Brown Brush, such a funny name, Madison Brush, who is the oldest daughter of Kody and Janelle, second oldest child of their 6, she decided she was going to do a podcast. Now, a lot of people thought it was pretty wild that she would announce this with the timing of what was going on in her life. One was because she is pregnant with her 3rd child. 2, she had just announced that she was launching a farm with her mom, Tata Farms, and they had a lot of work that they needed to do on getting that business off the ground. And 3, she had always been kind of a more private person, not someone that was super gossipy or anything like that. And so it just seemed like an interesting choice, right? Now, the podcast itself wasn't super much like tea related. It was talking about various topics within life. They talked about growing up, toxic families, boundaries, relationships, what you keep from your childhood, what you let go of your childhood. And sometimes within that podcast, Maddie would throw in a little bit of a tea. Now, some of the podcasts were interesting and others just at times people were like not as interested. They thought that it was a little bit pretentious. Maybe Maddie and her friend were getting a little bit too preachy about what it was that they thought. But it was supposed to be about the two of them being authentic and talking about things that are not necessarily what people talk about on social media. So Maddie, after having some success with the podcast, abruptly decided to quit, which is kind of odd. As quickly as she decided to move forward with this podcast and the launch of the podcast, she quit. And I think it was under in 2 months. So here is what she said. It was the closing of a chapter is the title. She wrote, after much reflection, I've decided to step away from the Authentic Society podcast. I've truly enjoyed the experience, learned so much, and I'm deeply grateful for the support from all of you. However, it's clear this project no longer aligns with my goals or the vision I have for my future and my family. While I'm closing this chapter with the Authentic Society, I'm not closing the door on podcasting forever. Who knows what the future might hold. For now, however, my focus is on the season I'm in. Being present and focusing on the well-being of my growing family, building Tata Farms, and starting the build of our new home. All of these things are where my heart currently is and what I feel needs my full focus right now. Thank you for being part of the journey. It meant the world to both Jamie and myself. Jamie will be continuing the podcast, and I will wish her all the love and support. Maddie. I always feel like when people say that it no longer aligns with her visions and her goals for her future and her family, that it's a really nice way of saying that there was a disagreement within the podcast. There was something that happened between Jamie and Maddie. And Jamie put up a video and she looked really upset, like she was crying. And I don't know what happened. Really, I don't. So in the world of PR, if you read between the lines, it sounds like something happened between the two of them. On the other hand, too, it also sounds like she has a lot on her plate, a lot, tons. And when you have this many kids and you have Tata Farms and you've got all these other things that you're doing and you're building a house and you're trying to add a podcast on top of that, it's a lot of work. And a lot of people think podcasting is easy. I've never done a podcast because I have like it set up as a podcast on my YouTube. Like you can click and there's podcast links, but that's just me posting stuff to YouTube. To do a professional podcast, to have the right equipment and the proper editing and the right studio and all of that goes into it, it's a lot of work. And then there's promotion and there is marketing. And if we're going to be completely honest, brand new podcasts don't make a lot of money. They don't. For the amount of work that you'll put into it in the beginning, the amount that you get out of it isn't a lot unless you unless you have the backing of a major podcast platform, or if say like Sirius picks it up or iHeartRadio. But if you're just trying to launch it on YouTube, you're not going to make that much money and you might not get the response you want out of it. And what I can say about this podcast is that initially, I think people were interested to see what she would have to say. They were interested to see what her perspective was. They were interested to see how she would tie things back from her life. But in a world where you're trying to be authentic, I do think that in order to be authentic, you have to be vulnerable. And Maddie was guarded, often guarded. She would say just enough about her upbringing or say just enough about what she went through as a child. But then she, I think, was probably very cognizant and aware of what she was saying would probably get picked up by tabloids. If she were to say anything about her dad or her mom, it could become an article or a video. And listen, we did talk about some of the things that she shared. And if you're going to do a podcast, you have to be aware that what you say on the podcast could get picked up in a soundbite. So if you know that your podcast is built on vulnerability and being honest and authentic, it can be hard to be both honest or authentic and vulnerable when your family lives under a microscope. So there's that part. And honestly, I can't blame her whatsoever because it would be hard for anyone to do that. The other thing I have for Maddie is that I think one thing is that people went to the podcast hoping they would get tea. And I think what they got wasn't what they wanted. I think if you look at the views of the podcast, when she talked about her dad, there was a big spike and she got a lot of views. But in the following podcasts, the views just kept dwindling, dwindling, and dwindling. The length of the podcasts were really long, longer than some podcasts, and they didn't always seem to follow a format. And because of the way that it was structured and the back and forth that went on between them and the topics in which they covered, there was a lot of loose ends that were left open on conversations. And sometimes the conversation would gear from Maddie to her friend Jamie, and Jamie had a tendency to be a lot more negative, a little bit more bitchy, and not as open. She almost would come off sometimes mean girl. And then when you'd listen to them having conversations, just my opinion, they didn't have anything in common at all, other than having dysfunctional families. Maddie's a mother of 3. Jamie's married and has no kids. Jamie's life is very different than Maddie's. And so there was a lot of, they didn't have anything to relate or talk about. So with that being said, I'm not surprised it failed. Okay. Now, Jamie did a video where she basically said that, part of being a podcaster is being vulnerable, which is true. And she mentioned that, she struggled with being vulnerable herself and that she was having issues with being real because she was afraid of what people would say. And sometimes when you are in defensive mode, you can, if you don't know and you're afraid of getting hurt, you might come off bitchy. I will say that the Jamie that we saw in the video that she shared was very different than the one on the podcast. The Jamie on the podcast that I watched was very bitchy. Okay. So she also shared this right before the announcement. And she said, so just before she announced that she was quitting the podcast, she posted that she was looking for a state of mental and emotional stability, composure, especially in the face of stress or tension, and the ability to remain calm and even-minded. And she was choosing the word equanimity as her word of the year, I guess. I've spent some time thinking about what I want this year to look like, not just in the big moments, but in the small, everyday ones too. What would my word be? Because I think intentional for another year seems a bit much. I wanted a similar essence. I kept coming back to this word, equanimity. It's not a word I use often, but it feels like exactly what I need right now. Life is full. Motherhood, marriage, a new baby on the way, building a farm, and just trying to keep everyone fed and somewhat sane. It's beautiful, fun, fills my heart, truly, but it can be a lot. For me, equanimity is about staying steady. It's not about pretending things aren't hard, but about finding a sense of peace even in the mess. It's learning to breathe through the tough moments and savor the good ones and sit in them and not rush to the next step. My hope is to lean more into the slow rooted and meaningful. It's so obvious to me that she's grieving, and maybe she thought the podcast would be an outlet for her to share some of that grief and talk through that and be an advocate around, mental health since she lost her brother. But she's in a very busy time of her life, so I can totally see why she would quit the podcast. She also shared this right after the New Year's. 2024 was a year of profound grief, anger, and unexpected growth and peace. Losing Garrison in March brought a kind of pain that touched every part of my life. Grief doesn't stay in one place, it spills over, makes room for other emotions for me. A lot of those emotions were anger. I spent much of this year sitting with that anger at circumstances, people, and memories that felt impossible to reconcile. While some of it has softened, it still lingers in my in moments. This year also brought clarity in relationships. I reconnected with people I wasn't sure I'd see again or speak to, and I also realized that some relationships, no matter how public or longstanding, needed to stay in the past for the sake of my peace and my children's well-being. Those decisions were hard but necessary. Yet 2024 wasn't without its light. Caleb and I are excited to welcome another baby girl, a blessing and a reminder of hope for the future. We also started Tata Farms, a dream we've poured ourselves into. Building something meaningful from the ground up has been grounding, healing, and experience for our family. Through it all, I've learned that healing isn't a straight path. It's messy, slow, and often found in stillness. As the year closes, my heart feels lighter. I've gained a deeper understanding of peace. Here's to 2025, a year of healing, hope, and beauty of new beginnings. So I've just thought of something as I read all of that. Sometimes when you're hurting and when you're grieving and when you are angry and stuck and you can't make sense of the world, sometimes it's easier to try to fix things for other people or to offer advice to other people. And maybe her leaving has to do with the fact that maybe the podcast for her was a distraction, a way for her not to have to sit in that grief and anger, and a way for her to focus energy on something else. And maybe through doing it, she realized that no matter how many times she tries to give advice to other people or share insight about what she knows and what she's learned, maybe she's also figured that she doesn't actually know everything and she doesn't have it all figured out. If you're going to, in my opinion, if you do a podcast where you're trying to give advice on life and around, therapy and topics that relate to healing, and a lot of it was geared around therapeutic concepts, a good place to start would be education and having resources available or professionals involved. Maybe the concept of the podcast was too much, but maybe the timing was also not the best. Another question is was her involvement in this not appreciated by the family? You always have to consider that when any of them get involved in something. Will this damage the show? Will it cause hurt to the show? Will Janelle or Kody pressure her or Christine pressure her not to be involved? They hate that McKelty and Tony have a Patreon. I can't imagine they would have loved that she had this podcast. I never saw any of them promoting it. They don't want anything to ruin the show. And maybe she has her mother living with her. Maybe she could have been bending to pressure of, you can't say this, you can't say that, you can't do that. And listen, if you are trying to be authentic and your family's under a contract, that can also be hard. I don't think she's reconciled with Kody, but it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that pressure from the family could have caused this to close. So at the end of the day, she is closing the chapter on the podcast. Some will look at this as another Brown failure, but you never know unless you try. And at least she tried. So what were your thoughts? Did you watch the podcast? Did you not watch the podcast? Are you surprised that she's stopping, or are you not surprised? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed, and click the bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye, guys.